All right. Hey, folks. So today's topic is going to be about load variations, or to put simply, rep ranges, different rep ranges, and the value of using different rep ranges and how you'd go about doing them and who would go about using different rep ranges. But firstly, thanks for making it onto my channel. If you have any questions or comments, pop them down below. And if you'd like to work with me on your own strength and physique goals, there's a link in the description. Also, go ahead and check out my podcast, check out my website, check out my Instagram, Facebook, my Patreon. Loads of cool stuff on there. I produce a ton of content. Go check it all out. And yeah, it'd be cool. Okay, so let's crack on with the video. So specifically, we're talking about load variation. So let's just describe what it is we're discussing and why we would want to vary load variations and who it would be useful for. So what are we talking about? Firstly, we're talking about a wide variety of rep ranges throughout the week. Okay, so throughout the week. So things like a DUP setup where you have different rep ranges, like lower reps one day, higher reps another day, medium reps another day, kind of like my wizard routine. Or something like a conjugate setup where you would do low repetitions and a variety of high repetitions to build up load. A very common way that a lot of modern strength coaches build their programs. They have low repetitions on the main exercises, high repetitions with potentially different equipment on the other exercises to build up the body parts. Very typical sort of conjugate style of training. And finally, traditional bodybuilder style training. So it's always been go heavy on the compounds, go light on the isos and the machines to drill in the detail. Obviously, that's not true, but certainly the variety helps. So a wider variety of rep ranges seems to induce more growth over time. There also appears to be, I guess, individual preferences. Like when I was a competitive powerlifter, my preference was actually the sets of 8, roughly 8 to 10. When I got down to 5s and 3s, I burnt out on those pretty quickly. And I know people like that. I actually coach people like that as well. So even as powerlifters, we keep them in the 5 to 8 rep range, or maybe even 10 rep range, because they build strength better in that range and they can peak a single better. But as soon as you get them into the 3s and 5s, they burn out. Singles and 8s, they're fine. Weird. So there is a variety there. And people seem to have some kind of individual preference. So some people do better on high reps, some people do better on low reps. It just is what it is. Now, I feel like at this point, it's important to differentiate what we're talking about here, which is a variety of rep ranges across a given week, with a longer scheme, like a variety of rep ranges over, say, 12 weeks, like the classic linear periodization cycles. Those have pretty much fallen out of favor in recent years, which I think for possibly good reason as well. I always found when I did linear periodization cycles, and I only did them for a while, and I quickly let go of them, 15, 20 years ago, that you tended to lose the ability to do low repetition work at the beginning of the cycle and vice versa at the end of the cycle. So they just weren't very useful. You lost the qualities that they built very, very quickly. So that's not what's being discussed. What's being discussed here is simultaneously doing a wider variety of rep ranges in the same week, maybe even in the same session. Okay, so just bear in mind that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about doing a variety of rep ranges over 12 weeks. That's not what we're talking about today. Okay, what does the science say? Now, I wanted to make a point about this because while the science does support what I'm saying, I am personally going to make an effort to stop trying to lean on the science on this channel from here on out, as I think there are far too many people out there who lean on the science when it suits them and then ignore it otherwise, or actively take a stance against the science otherwise. It just looks bad. They don't mean to do it. They'll bring up a study when it supports what they do. Otherwise, they'll poo-poo the study or the science or whatever, either ignoring it or just completely going against it and like calling them nerds. I just think it looks bad. It looks inconsistent, and you guys deserve better. So while I don't lean on the science massively, I'm going to make an effort to publicly talk about it less and just focus on my experience, because I feel that's more valuable. Nothing against science. I'm not anti-science. In fact, I still read a lot of papers, but just for my communications with you guys on YouTube, I'm going to make an effort to be more consistent with just being more practical and more, I guess, just shooting more from the hip. I just don't want to be one of those guys who brings you the latest studies and then doesn't have all of his views completely in line with science, because I just think it doesn't look good. There's too many people out there who do that, and I think it's contradictory. Anyway, moving on. So the bottom line is load variation is useful. It appears to be beneficial for both strength and hypertrophy. So when I talk about load variation, I'm essentially talking about different rep ranges. Okay. So I think the load variation is useful for a bunch of different reasons. In and of itself, the variety seems to be beneficial. It seems to be good to get a wide range of different reps and different loading ranges. The second thing is, due to the higher degree of variety, it may allow for more volume to be performed. Now, in general, if you can perform more useful volume and recover from it, odds are it's going to be more beneficial for growth. So that's something. Third thing is, mentally, it can be more stimulating. People like to have a bit of a change of pace, different feel, a different focus. Like with my wizard routine, it's quite nice to go in on a heavy day, go in all guns blazing, heavy metal on the headphones, and in a light day, it's more of a therapeutic day. So you go in with a different vibe. And finally, I think speculatively speaking, it may be a case of, rather than each individual aspect of the rep ranges being beneficial, it might just be the case of it's better than what you were doing the previous day because it's a change. It might simply be the newness of the stimulus. So if you do heavy day on a Monday and on a Wednesday you do a light day, it may just be the newness of the stimulus and whatever cascade that has on the body. That means it's just better than last time. It may just be that. It may just be the fact that a change is better than the same thing over and over again. So there's a few reasons why load variation might be useful, and it has worked, and it seems to work in my experience. So in terms of the actual rep ranges, now we know that the rep ranges of about 5 to 30 are useful, and that corresponds with roughly 60% of the loading range in about 30 rep range to anything up to 85 to 90%. Okay, so we know there's a useful rep ranges, 5 to 30-ish. Now, the typical bread and butter rep ranges are about 5 to 12. The common 5x5, right up to 3 sets of 8 to 12. That's pretty common. Now, the reason that I think these are common and that they work so well is that it's easy to work hard on this, if that makes sense. If you do a set of, say, 5 to 12, and you just work hard and try and take your sets to failure, you'll likely land in the right place, because the weight is usually heavy enough to activate most of your fibers that are most hypertrophic right from the beginning, okay? Particularly if you've got the lower rep ranges like the 5s to 8s. So it's easier to work hard in those rep ranges because you're forced to work hard right from the first rep. So that's why I think most people stick to that broad rep range, and it's not a bad idea. Like sets of 5 are growth inducing. They're great as long as they're done reasonably hard with like relatively close to failure. So 5 to 12 is a good rep range. It's a classic rep range for a reason. Now, when you start to get to rep ranges higher than that, so especially when you start to get to rep ranges in the 20 to 30 range, I only reserve those reps for the more advanced clients. Typically speaking, it's harder to train to failure and close with reps of 30 or 20 to 30. It's harder work, okay? Simply because every single rep is a smaller percentage of your road to failure. So you can push and you can push and you can push, and even a slight form adjustment, a deeper breath between reps can eke out 1 or 2 more reps. It's a lot harder to go to failure. It gets very painful. Form starts breaking down. Mentally, people just get unfocused. So it takes somebody who's got a good degree of form solidly ingrained, of focus, of good sort of fortitude and skill to go that high and still work hard. That's why it's generally only reserved for something that advanced people do. If you were to give a beginner sets of 30, it would be a mess. The form is not ingrained anywhere near enough. The focus, the intensity is just not there. They would succumb to either form breakdown or just pain way before they actually finished. It would feel like failure, sure, but it wouldn't be muscular failure. So that's why it's generally reserved for the more advanced folks. So in general, your bread and butter is about the 5 to 12 range. Now, I have produced a chart. I have a chart here, which is what I think is a general sort of decent rule of thumb. I think if you're a ranked beginner, something like 5 to 10 rep range is pretty good. You can't really go wrong with that rep range when you're a beginner. The reps are low enough that you can maintain your focus, okay? And I say 5 to 10, it could be around that range, but even 12 is fine, but roughly there. So it's low enough that you can maintain your focus, okay? All you need to do is just focus for between 5 to 10 repetitions, do what you need to do. It's heavy enough that your muscles are going to be taxed even from the first rep if you go down to 5s. So for beginners, this is the easier rep range to work harder in. Now, for intermediates, I think they can benefit from rep ranges a little bit higher. They have more focus, they have more control, the form is more ingrained, and for potentially exercises which are a little bit easier to control, they might want to go right the way up to 20. This is often the time when you start to see people looking at 20 rep squat routines, if you guys remember those, 20 rep deadlift routines. I think probably not the best idea for an intermediate, actually, a horrendous idea for a beginner, because form will just fall apart on those big exercises. But, you know, sets of 20 on perhaps the bench press, the row, the curls, stuff like that is probably okay. Done in the way that I've been talking about over the last few weeks in the videos, the first set should be your hard set with lots of reps, and then letting the reps drop off. So I don't feel that intermediates would benefit from going right the way up to 30 reps because they just lack that focus. Now, for an advanced guy, not only would he be able to, or she be able to tolerate the higher repetitions, I think they would also be able to benefit from them as well. And that's really where the wider variety comes into play. And just like with all the rest of the things, advanced guys would benefit from not only the wider variety of repetitions, but also a wide variety of exercises, equipment, and which all allows for more variety and more volume. The advanced guy will be more tolerant of these higher workloads if he has more variety. So that's kind of what I'm looking at here. That seems to line up quite well with volume totals for beginners and intermediates and advanced, as well as the amount of variety they need to actually succeed during the course of the week without just tearing themselves apart. Okay, so here's kind of my summary and some concluding thoughts. We're all trying to eke out the most of our time in the gym. I think load variations potentially allow us to get more hypertrophy and strength, okay, from the same number of sets with less cost, as in fatigue. So that's a pretty good deal, okay? There aren't many things in life where you can get more for less, right? So in a sense, this is what we're doing. We are getting more hypertrophy for the same number of sets with less fatigue cost. That's a pretty good deal. Now, all of this stuff only becomes relevant the more advanced you get. Like for a beginner doesn't need a high degree of variety. They train on Monday, they're ready to go again on Wednesday, and they're stronger. Like, how good is that? So, and I will create a video explaining the differences between beginners, intermediates, and advanced, because I think there's some confusion around that in the YouTube space, and I want to address that. So I think, finally, just to say, load variations need to be seen with nuance, shocking, and they need to be used appropriately. Okay, so I'm not suggesting that all beginners do this. So just to ward off any of those kind of comments, I think this is something to consider when it's needed. If you're at the point where you need to induce more growth by potentially doing more volume, you need to mix things up, it would be in your best interest to try. This is one of the first things I would try, okay? Because let's face it, going from leg presses for sets of 10 to hack squats for sets of 10, as far as what the muscle feels, it's pretty similar. And I think a large majority of you, because I look at the common programs that are out there, and I imagine a large majority of you probably do very similar reps throughout the whole of your program. Now, if you're a beginner, that's fine. But if you're more advanced than that, you need more variety. And all of my advanced guys, they have a lot more variety in their program for that reason. It accomplishes quite a lot. In terms of how to kind of split this up, I think, let's say you are a late stage intermediate and you're looking for some variety. Great. You may want to incorporate a couple of different rep ranges. So you may want to do the bread and butter. Let's say you're a bodybuilder. You may want to do the bread and butter of your work up to roughly sets of 8 to 12 in that kind of 10 rep range. Great. Now, if you're slightly intermediate, you may want to introduce maybe a quarter to a third of your volume in that kind of like 15 to 20 rep range, maybe 10 to 20, 15 to 20. It just gives you a bit more variety. It's completely different loading. So it allows you to get a little more variety, and you'll probably feel a lot better getting that wider range of variety in. Now, if you're very advanced, that's where some of this stuff comes in, where you can do both, all of that kind of stuff, but also implement some very high repetition work. And typically, it'll either be straight sets, which is fine, or it could be things like supersets, drop sets, giant sets, all that kind of good stuff. All the, the typical bread and butter advanced pro bodybuilder muscle tech type of stuff, right? Just to get those high repetition works in. That's typical. It's quite good to use. And as long as you're using them and keeping them as a very small part of the overall workout, it's useful. I don't think those should be a major part of your week, even if you're advanced, because they're not typically like that useful. But again, they're useful for volume in a small capacity. They should get you some very, very good pumps. And I think possibly one thing to note is the moment they stop giving you really good pumps is probably when you should back off and go back down to the regular rep ranges, because the 20s and 30s are quite an unusual stimulus, and you've got to be very careful with them. You can burn out of them very quickly, and when you burn out of them, you're not going to get those nice pumps, and they just become a bit pointless. So back down to a decent rep range, 5 to 10, 10 to 20. But they're useful variation for the right individuals, the more advanced guys. All right, folks. So I thought I would call that there. Hopefully that's kind of useful. As I say, this stuff is applicable the more advanced you get, because you do need variety, which allows you to grow more when you need a different range of stimulus as you become more and more advanced. Again, it's not something that's going to apply to beginners, probably not even early intermediates, but it's certainly a tool in the toolbox as and when you need it. And it's a very good one. It's a very, very good one, because it's far different from just switching from a leg press to a hack squat or a bench press to a dumbbell bench. It's a completely different stimulus, a completely different loading range. Your muscles will completely recognize the load variation and the stimulus differently. So it's a very powerful tool, and it's something which I think is worth playing around with when the time is right. Right, folks, I'm going to call it there. Hopefully you guys had got something from that, and I'll speak to you in the next one.